Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. We're going to be talking about the PlayStation 4 Neo. So it tends to be that when information appears on the internet, another source also decides to divulge information that they know as well, I guess because they, the talk stirs something up within them. Well, in this case, we now have some information regarding a possible spec upgrade for the system, and this was actually spurred on by Sony's own first-party studios, we'll get into that in a moment, and also a possible release date for the Neo. So just yesterday, we did tackle the fact that Sony were going to be holding, supposedly, a special event in New York to unveil the system, during which we could presumably see things such as the possible graphic upgrades for the games. We should know more about the pricing and all of that stuff. Well, as I mentioned, since then information has started to appear. Now this information, thanks to Kenny Linder, who is a former Sony employee, he actually was the first to confirm that The Last Guardian would indeed be seeing light on the PS4 and not the PS3. And he says, and I quote, "Up until recently the specs weren't 100% final. Mainly amount of RAM. Some Sony first-party teams were asking for more. I don't know if they got it in the end." End quote. Now, what's rather interesting about this is in another quote, he mentions that the possible release date, which was what was echoed yesterday from various websites, including Gameblog, that date sounds very good to him because his studio is set to receive the final development kits coinciding with that type of timing. Now obviously at the moment they have the earlier versions of development kits, and as the system becomes closer and closer to the final retail specifications, the specifications change over time. So it could be, for example, that they have more RAM early on, or they have less RAM early on, or maybe it has a less powerful CPU or GPU or whatever. Or it could be that the system very much acts like a development, like the final retail machine in terms of the performance, but it could just be very messy. And this is very much what happens with the early Xbox development kits. You might recall how there were actually several laptops that turned into the very early Xbox prototypes, and even the N64 wasn't actually a console. Early development kits were actually essentially PCs. But anyway, I'm getting very off topic. Now, what makes this even more juicy is that he believes the PS4 Neo will actually launch in November, since they were told that Sony were aiming to have the system available to customers before Thanksgiving. So that basically means, theoretically, late November is the latest possible release date for the Neo. If you've been following along with the console's rumours for any certain amount of time, you'll know that it is the PlayStation 4 but on steroids. So you have a vastly improved GPU, 36 compute units at 911 MHz, the same Jaguar processor but with a roughly 30% improvement to the clock speed, so it's running at 2.1 GHz. The same amount of RAM, physical amount of memory in the system, 8 GB running at 218 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. The difference is Sony have provisioned an additional 512 megabytes of that memory to developers. So in short, the system OS is taking less of its pound of flesh, and that memory has instead been given to developers. So this is a little outside the video. I don't want to do a full technical analysis on an offhand, off-the-cuff remark. But there are a couple of possibilities, distinct possibilities. The first is that if the title is running on a Neo console in Neo mode, the OS could have even less reserves. For example, Sony might have reduced the OS reserve by another 512 megabytes. So essentially they're giving it an extra 1 gigabyte of memory. Another possible solution would be that they've simply soldered on more memory to the board. Now, how that would work in reality is a bit of a mystery. It would mean quite the change to the actual physical PCB, unless they're going with larger size DIMMs, which would presumably mean that they possibly could have up to 16 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory, or a larger bus, and for example 320-bit, and they're going to have, let's say, oh, I don't know, 12 gigabytes of memory, which is very much akin to what the Scorpio is doing. Now, one possibility for Sony actually carrying on with this is quite simple. The Xbox Scorpio has a lot more memory, a lot more. Yes, it has a lot more GPU power as well, but considering the Scorpio is looking to have 12 gigabytes of memory, that's about 4 gigabytes additionally than the original system. That's a lot of memory for extra textures and whatever else. So you're looking at the gulf between the two systems to be at least 3.5 gigs, which is an awful lot of RAM for developers, even if the Neo isn't as powerful as a Scorpio, so we can presume that it will have, let's say, lower quality, lower resolution internal rendering or whatever they do. There is still quite the disparity between the two pieces of hardware. Now, Sony could also opt to increase the clock speed, probably not of the CPU, but they could certainly increase the speed of the GPU. They could possibly add in a whole bunch of extra compute units as well, but that would mean an awful lot of engineering. That would mean a possible complete redesign of the GPU, depending on what they're doing. If they're using a Polaris 10 based piece of silicon, so the same piece of GPU technology that's found within the RX 480, they can't really do anything because none of the CUs are actually disabled for the RX 480. However, I am being presumptuous because I am going on the information that they've said that it's an all-new GPU, but it could be an older iteration of GCN, but it's more likely at this point that they're going with a newer iteration of GCN, which would be Polaris, let's face it. Now, Polaris can run on the desktop at 1266 MHz, which is quite the upclock from 911. The problem is, you can't just linearly increase the clock speed to, let's say, 1200 MHz and not have the power consumption shoot up through the roof. We can presume that it's still part of the same SoC, so they probably won't be separate chips. It's possible, but very unlikely. So that means that really they can only go ahead and upclock the GPU a certain amount, or they're going to need to have a seriously beefier cooling system. With that said, we don't know what the cooling system is of the Neo. However, let's say they increase the clock speeds somewhere along the lines of 950 megahertz, 960, 970. It's a subtle increase in performance, but it could well be enough to help offset the system. As you're possibly aware, currently the Neo puts out about 4.2 T-flops of GPU performance. If they increase that clock speed to 970 megahertz, you're looking at around 4.47 T-flops. And if you're being very ambitious, you could go all the way up to 1050, which means about 4.83. It's very unlikely they're going to be able to match the Scorpio. Even if they increase the clock speed to 1150, they're going to be slightly out. And honestly, at that type of speed, they're probably going to be increasing the power consumption and heat output of the system to uncomfortable levels. So Microsoft probably have a hardware advantage. Well, not probably, they do have a hardware advantage, because Microsoft have confirmed the performance, of course, of the Scorpio. We know that. What is quite interesting is that Sony have been rather boisterous regarding the possibility of different methodologies of rendering, for example, tile-based rendering. And what they have said is that and this is based upon the Rainbow Six implementation. Now, it's actually rather complex to go into, but essentially they won around 8 to 10 milliseconds per frame in best case scenarios. And they were rendering at, I believe, 960 by 440, and then they used checkerboard rendering to 1080. So it actually was a very interesting method for them to use this, and their actual technology, by the way, they were inspired by the folks over at Guerrilla Games, who of course use a very similar methodology for Killzone Shadowfall. And what that did is it used half of the information from the previous frame when rendering the next frame, and what that did was to help alleviate the workload on the GPU. Now, Sony, as I mentioned, does want developers to start pushing high resolutions, and in fact, in their own technical details of the machine, which they were supposedly giving to developers, they said that they don't really want folks to be natively rendering at 1440p. That's not a target, because they don't believe the jump from 1440p from 1080p on a large 4K television is enough. Now, obviously, that does depend on the screen size. For example, let's say that you're playing on a 28-inch screen on your PC at 4K. Well, that looks pretty damn impressive, and you can certainly get away with running at a lower resolution. For example, you could probably get away with 1440p, especially if you're a little bit further back. On the other hand, if you're on a large screen, for example, 50 inches, sitting at a modest distance away, that's when things become a bit sticky and dicier, because that's when you can start noticing jaggers and a lot of softness in the image, and this is particularly true if your screen is not the best and you start noticing a lot of processing. Although, of course, there is always the internal upscaler, which does its damnedest to upscale the image, but ultimately there's only a certain amount it can do. And that's where the sticky situations come in. With all of that said, I'm quite looking forward to the Neo and the Scorpio. I'm not necessarily advising people to rush out and buy it, especially at launch, which inevitably we will see people do. My whole thing is, I think you should give it a couple of months, or at the very least, see how developers treat it. Now, for example, if it's only that developers push a higher resolution through games and that's about it, then probably not worth it for a lot of folks unless you've got a 4K television. On the other hand, if we start seeing games run at better quality, generally, for example, we might see better anti-aliasing techniques, we might see more prestigious use of higher quality multi-sampling. We might see, for example, FXAA or other such technology maybe fall by the wayside, and we may see the implementations of more expensive softening techniques, for example MSAA or something else. And then of course there is other possibilities, for example higher frame rate. Ultimately it all comes down to the game and what developers are capable of pushing. Now, of course, Sony's own studios are probably a good benchmark, and there is no, as far as I understand it, there is like some leniency. So Sony aren't necessarily expecting developers to go all out for the Neo mode, but they do want the game at the very least to perform equally on the Neo compared to the native system. So you can't see a deficit in the frame rate. But what you can do, of course, is take advantage of that extra performance. I don't necessarily know if Sony are going to be putting strict enforcement. So, for example, they're going to say, well, if you're going to go the Neo route, you're going to have to at least hit this resolution or this target frame rate, because ultimately they're probably going to have to leave it down to developers, which is what Microsoft are doing. Frankly, I prefer that, because it means that developers can better utilize the hardware how they feel is appropriate for the game. So, for example, if you're creating an action-orientated title, for example, Bloodborne, I would love for Bloodborne to receive a post-release patch, and for them to, let's say, increase the frame rate of the game to 60 FPS on a Neo. Whether that will happen, whether it's even possible, for example, if all of the animations for the game and other bits and pieces were originally created for 30 FPS in general, and some titles you have, let's say, the physics which are keyed directly to that frame rate, there can be a lot of problems. And that's why, of course, Sony are certainly not going to push developers and say, yeah, you need to patch that game from 2 years ago, because A, it would be a lot of work for the studio, and B, if they had not created the title and it was exclusive to the system, it just may not be physically possible for them to do it. Anyway, that's my opinion, and I kind of got a little off topic with this video, so hopefully you'll forgive me, but hopefully you've also enjoyed it. With that said, take care of yourselves. Bye for now.